to tell us? Well, I never knew that I would ever have to. I never imagined I'd see all three of them in my old goat house the day before my daughter's wedding. The old goat house? Rosie and Tanya ran off to find the old goat house. No, wait. Shoot. Rosie. Tanya, wait a minute. Don't let him hear you. There's no one there, and there's no one here. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure. To think I would forget my daughter's dads. They were all here. Sam Carmichael, Bill Anderson, and Harry Headbanger. Not Harry Headbanger. They must come back to their boat. I hope they ran aground and drowned. What are they doing here? It's like some hideous trick of fate. The local people are burst out laughing. Rosie to Tanya. It's very Greek. Donna, Rosie, and Tanya entered the house. Rosie to Donna. Did you know that Sophie? What? Are they psychic? No, I never told this soul. Oh, Donna. Keeping it to yourself all these years. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter about me. The only thing that matters is that Sophie never finds out. Well, maybe she would be cool with it. Cool with it? You don't know my daughter. This would be like a bombshell. Donna, they've gone. I don't know that. I don't know where they are. I don't know why they're here. And I have brought this all on myself because I was a stupid, reckless little slut. Whoa, don't you sound like your mother? I do not. Yes, you do. Oh my god, I do not. You do. It's Catholic guilt. You believe like a nun. Yeah, whatever happened to our Donna? Life and soul of the party. El Rakshik Supremo. I grew up. Well then, grow back down again. Screw 'em if they can't take a joke. You can dance, you can jive, having the time of your life. See that girl, watch that scene, taking the dancing queen. Friday night and the lights are low, looking out for a place to go, where to play the round music. Getting in the swing, you come to look for a king. Anybody can be that guy. Not as young and the music's high. With a bit of rock music, everything is fine. You're in the mood for a dance. And when you get the chance, you are the dancing queen, young and sweet, only 17. Dancing queen, feel the beat from the tambourine. Oh yeah, you can dance, you can jive, having the time of your life. Ooh, see that girl, watch that scene, digging the dancing queen. You're a teaser, you turn 'em on, lead a burning and then you're gone. Looking up for another, anyone will do. You're in the mood for a dance. And when you get the chance, you are the dancing queen, young and sweet, only 17. Bill, Sam, and Harry are back on the boat, ready to sail around the island. Sophie, Ellie, and Lisa run down the jetty, shouting, "Wait, don't leave." Sophie jumps into the water and swims to the boat. "Whoa, Sophie! 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 You gonna sail around the island? You wanna come? You promise you come to my wedding?" Yes. Well, your mother ejected us from the goat house. The goat house. It's not British. I can't even fake British. Donna. No, Bill is not. Harry. We thought we'd better get out of her hair. Donna freaked out when she saw us. What's all that about? No, she's not even thinking straight. She's so stressed about the wedding. You know, she's got no idea that you're her lovely surprise. She'll be so happy tomorrow. You think so? Sophie to Harry. Harry, you took Mom's guitar. No, I borrowed it. Look. No, where is it? D.S. Donna Sheridan and H.B. Headbanger. Headbanger? I bought her this. It cost me 10 quid plus my Johnny Rotten t-shirt. Your mother knew quite a rebel. I was studying in Paris when I met her. I hopped on a train, followed her to Greece, quite spontaneously. Oh my god, my British is... I can still recall our last summer. I still see it all. Walks along the Seine, laughing in the rain. Our last summer, memories that remain. We made our way along the river and sat out in the grass by the Eiffel Tower. I was so happy we had met. It was a time of regret. Yes. God, I thought I could nail these songs, but well, let's just improvise. Those crazy years was a time out of flower power. But I knew we had a fear of flying, of growing old, a fear of slowly dying. We took a chance, like we were dancing our last dance. I can still recall our last summer. I still see it all in the tourist jam round the Notre Dame. Our last summer, walking hand in hand, Paris restaurants. Our last summer, morning croissants, living for the day, worries far away. Our last summer, we could laugh and play. Sophie to Harry. And I working in the bank. If I'm a man, a football man, and your name is Harry. Harry, how dull it seems. Sophie, are you the hero of my dreams? My dreams. This guy is looking for Sophie on the mainland. Sophie. Please, I have to go. But please come tomorrow, okay? Absolutely. We'll be there. It's a promise. Oh. Walks along the Seine, laughing in the rain. Our last summer, memories that remain. Sky, where have you been? People have been arriving all afternoon. No one's seen you. I'm sorry. I was around the island. I just lost track of time. Where are you going? It's my stag day. My last night of freedom. Huh? Which is how some people might see it. For me, it's the last night before the greatest adventure of my life. You know how I said I wanted to find my father. So, we've been over this a million times. You don't need a father. You have a family. You never leave me, right? Are you kidding? Oh my god, if someone's from the UK that watches this, I'm sorry. But it's funny to what do you say, imitate accent. Are you kidding? You turned my world upside down. I wasn't jealous before you met. Now every man that I see is a potential threat. And I'm possessive, it isn't nice. You are me saying that smoking was my only vice. But now it isn't true. And now everything is new. And all I've learned has overturned. I beg of you, don't go wasting your emotion. Lay all your love on me. It was like shooting a sitting duck. A little small talk, smiling, baby, I was stuck. I still don't know what you done with me. A grown woman should never fall so easily. I feel a kind of fear. Oh, and I don't have you near. Unsatisfied, I skip my pride. I beg you, dear, don't go wasting your emotion. Lay all your love on me. Don't go sharing your devotion. Lay all your love on me. Don't go sharing your devotion. Lay all your love on me. It is now evening. It is now the evening. And also his friend are having a party. Tana's voice is heard, amplified from inside the house. Ladies and no gentlemen, presenting for one night and one night only, because that's all we got breathe for. Speak for yourself, you old bad. The world's first girl power band, Donna and the Dynamos. Donna, Rosie, and Tanya. Super Trooper. Oh, no. Super Trooper, lights are gonna find me, but I won't feel blue like I always do, 'cause somewhere in the crowd there is you. I was sick and tired of everything, When I called you last night from Glasgow, all I do is eat and sleep and sing, wishing every show was the last show. Show was the last show. So imagine I was glad to hear you coming. Suddenly I feel right. And suddenly it's gonna be different when I'm on the stage tonight. Tonight is super trooper, lights are gonna find me. Sam, Bill, and Harry are approaching. Our song, your song, it's my song. Smiling, having fun, feeling like you're number one. Tonight the super trooper beams are gonna blind me, but I won't feel blue like I always do, 'cause somewhere in the crowd there's you. So I'll be there when you arrive. The sight of you brought to me, I'm still alive when you take me in your arms and hold me tight. I know it's gonna mean so much tonight. Tonight a super trooper lights are gonna find me, shining like the sun, smiling, having fun, feeling like a number one. Tonight a super trooper beams are gonna